Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. Now, next week, we're going to hit a very important milestone in the TDAPE journey. We're going to hit 200 episodes, and over the last couple of weeks, maybe even the last couple of months, I've been reflecting on lots of the conversations I've had, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to bring some of those really interesting chats that have made me think the most, which is really difficult because of all the 200 episodes, every one has made me think long and hard about education. And, I learned so much just from talking to really inspirational teachers. But some of the things have been playing on my mind or have been sort of prioritized in my thinking. And so I thought I'd bring them back to the front of your mind as well. So we've got some really interesting chats across a number of themes. And I've taken select questions that I think, you might benefit from, having brought to the fore again. Go, oh yeah, I remember that. I put a pin in that and never really went back to it. So hopefully you enjoy this. This won't be a regular format, but I thought, because we're about to bridge into our second century, that it would be a nice time to reflect on what the discussions we've had over the last 100 episodes. And hopefully next week I'll be here with a special 200th celebration. But we'll see about that. Now, don't forget that the first TDAPE conference is happening in Bromley in London on the 18th of January 2025. We're going to have fantastic speakers, lots of different subjects, from reading, modern foreign languages, special educational needs, English as additional language. And it's going to be a fantastic day, raising money for a really great cause in the Velindre Cancer Centre. And so tickets are available. I think I've posted on all the major social media platforms a link to the ticket, but I'll put it into this episode description as well. Get your tickets now while you can. It's going to be a fantastic day, and hopefully you'll join us and spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So without further ado, let's get on with it. Some things that I think, might be worth thinking about again, and hopefully you enjoy. So how can we establish scaffolding as an effective part of our practice?
First of all, buy our book and we'll give you lots of ideas. No, I think the first thing to think about is the content of your lesson and the main teaching activities you use to teach that content. So as history teachers, Alex and I do a lot of reading, a lot of independent writing, a lot of looking at sources and unpicking sources, doing source skills. So those are our typical classroom activities. And from that point, I think then you can think about what are some of the main scaffolding approaches we might use. But then I think it is even diving even deeper than that and thinking about for each individual lesson, what's the content I need to teach that's going to be high pitched, and that should come obviously from your curriculum planning that you've done as a team or as a subject together. What scaffolding approaches can we then use that are going to ensure that all students have got the same access to the lesson? So we're starting with everyone learning the same curriculum, everyone's entitled to the same curriculum, but how can we then ensure that we scaffold up to support all learners? So like I said earlier, I think that the kind of before and during lesson approach and after actually is a really good way of thinking about it. So before the lesson, what are the barriers that I'm going to face? What are the potential misconceptions? Where might students struggle? At what point might they struggle to become independent? What strategies can I then put in place to scaffold? So could I have a glossary available? Could I have some sentence stems? Could I use some individual circulation around the class at certain points? Could I show them a great model? Could we do a we do together? Could I reduce the amount of content? All of these things can be scaffolds. Do my assessment for learning and decide at that moment what particular scaffolding approaches are needed. And then afterwards, I think there is like a post-mortem that you need to do at the lesson, like Alex said, related to that snag list. What worked, what didn't, what might I need to go back and reteach? And again, looking at books is so vital. And I'm not saying marking because I think we talked previously about my feelings about marking. But you need to be looking at books in the same way you need to be circulating during your lesson. You need to be taking that feedback from all of your learners. So you need to be looking at books to see, well, what do I need to go back and reteach or do more modelling on, do more scaffolding on before I can then move on. I think that approach, I think, is a really logical way of thinking about scaffolding that's needed. And then obviously on top of that, thinking about at what point I'm going to remove it, and let there be that more independent, that chance for more independence.
For me, like the way that you make it most effective is you make sure that it aligns with your whole school teaching and learning policies and your curriculum as well, so that it's not kind of like bolt on. It's not like a frog with a kind of Dolly Parton rodeo hat on. You don't understand why it's there and what it's doing. I don't know where that analogy's come from, but you can have that. But essentially, they've got to see it as part and parcel of it, as part of the kind of the cake mixture, if you like. That's probably a better one, because otherwise people will see it as a bolt on. It's a thing that we are kind of adding on and in the lesson, rather thinking, as Rachel said, integral to how are we scaffolding the curriculum to make sure that we are teaching to the top. How do we make sure that our teaching and learning practice means that we are being inclusive, and that we're using formative assessment really strongly to be able to adapt and be responsive, to know when to remove those scaffolds and add those scaffolds. So it's even things like thinking about, if you've been working, hard on your assessment and feedback policy, how are you scaffolding like feedback? How are you making sure that children are really clear about what their granular action step is, and not only what is it, how do you do it, and why are you doing that kind of improvement and feeding that forward? So I think it's really good to be interwoven, and whether that's, your rows and shines, you walk through, whatever it is that you've got in your school, is really thinking about that implementation and how you're going to make sure that staff see something where this is empowering their teaching practice rather than a distraction from. It's not that split attention sort of effect. And I think the best ways is kind of really modeling your CPD in a similar way to scaffolding. And I talked about that before. So doing your before, your during, and your afterwards. But within that process, really working in advance with those who are going to be driving it, listening to them during the process of that implementation, and calibrating as you kind of go forward with that. Because I think a strong part of scaffolding is metacognitive oracy. I think the more that you're explaining kind of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and I think we've got to apply that to our CPD as well. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is how we can do it when we're looking at teaching and learning principles and curriculum. What might this look like in your subject, in your phase, and go away and have some time to really think about how you're going to how you're going to really powerfully implement that within your curriculum in a way that's going to be workload efficient but high impact. And I think, Rachel's kind of talked about that after thing, how you're really going to measure the impact of that scaffolding that you're doing, so you can, learn lessons going forward.
I think that relates to what you said earlier about the lethal mutations of like evidencing scaffolding. I think it's really, really important that as leaders, we are looking at books. I think subject team book looks are a great idea. What are these books telling us as a team about maybe points in our curriculum, what we need to focus on more, but also teaching and learning wise as well. And as we said earlier, the point is not to evidence scaffolding, but you should be looking to see whether students are making good progress, answering incomplete complete questions. If you've got work that's incomplete, if there's misconceptions, if there's poor structuring of answers, all of those things will indicate that more scaffolding needs to happen. So I think that's a really key part of any implementation, is making sure that you just are revisiting those books. But it's not about evidencing the scaffolding, and it's not about leaders looking for scaffolding in books. It's about looking for progress in the best way that you can in a book. Obviously we can't see learning, but there are indicators that will tell us whether students are learning, and that's why
I think that links to quality assurance as well. Like, and I'm loath to use the word quality assurance, but if your observations, your learning walks, it's about being mindful that you might not physically see scaffolding, like when you go, like how a mathematician scaffolds, how a music teacher scaffolds. And that's why you've really got to ensure that you're having those curriculum conversations where they can tell you what the scaffolding is and how they've planned for that and what they've been doing, that those beautiful invisible moments where they're making magic happen. And you're watching a magician in play. There's awe and wonder going on. You're not quite sure how that's happening, but it's happening. And speaking to the children and seeing how that kind of might be echoed in books. It won't always be echoed because we know some of it's verbal. And so we might not see that actually that scaffold that teaching gave through like a verbal nudge is what led to that beauty in the work. So I think as part of the, I hate to say it, quality assurance process. It's how you're unpicking how scaffolding is being implemented in your school in a really rounded, triangulated way that isn't evidence for the sake of evidence.
Yeah, I once had a maths lead who said to me, anyone who uses evidence as a verb is getting a wide berth. Well, maybe maybe
I
not as
like
polite as that.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard, I've heard one school where they're going to get I do, we do, you do stickers, and every time that you provide a model to a SEND student, you have to stick it in their book. So there's some really horrendous stuff out there, and it's about how we just, as Mary Myatt says, that we're humans first and professionals second. Just being a little bit common sense with this.
So you guys won't be giving away scaffolding stamps with your book.
Now there's an idea.
Yeah, it's tempting. Or maybe we just get a stamp that says, if you are doing this, you need to be avoided, and then you can just stamp people who are insisting on it.
No teaching assistants asked if they want a copy of my book. No?
Yours is sold out, mate. So
It's disappointing. I mean, in all seriousness, I think this speaks to why the conversation about implementation is perhaps not as developed as other parts of the discourse on education. Because, right, if I followed you correctly through that, you've identified what it was you wanted to change and how you want to change it. You've then clarified it. You've explained it and perhaps modeled it virtually because of the sort of constraints of the time. You've tested it. You've followed up. You've made incremental improvements. You developed it, and then you've embedded it. And that doesn't fit on a poster. And so, I mean, maybe it does, but people like threes, and they remember threes. You've got quite a few things there to think about, and it just shows, it's not messy, but it's not succinct either. There's a lot to that. I mean, how have you gone about actually doing this?
yeah, it's I think that was a lovely way to summarize it. Really, I think I'll echo what you said there. I believe implementation is one of the things we talk about probably the least in education, certainly in the primary sector. And for me, it's probably one of the most important things, certainly in school improvement and schools that need improving, is it's the how you do it. And there's, like I've said this before when I've spoken live, there's so much excellent content and principles and books and studies and things that we can use in schools, but workmen and tools and all that. And it's how it gets enacted. It's how do you actually get this across and successful and, like you said, embedded and sustained. And it is just it's a persistent problem in schools, isn't it? And it's one of those ones where I don't know that you never finish the job really as such. You constantly review and iterate and review, but it's something, I feel like we need to give this more airtime because it's so important. And I just can't stress enough how much I value when I read a blog or I read a book or I read or I talk to someone, hear a talk in a conference or something, and someone really outlines like how they've done something. For me as a leader, they are the most sort of valuable bits of learning that I do. I like hearing and especially hearing when people get things wrong and go, that didn't work. And, we found this really, really hard and this didn't work, being really honest and reflective about it and going, okay, yeah, because we can all paint a picture, can't we? We can all paint a picture on social media or even here now on this podcast. I'd be painting some picture here, and we're all painting a picture of what our kind of ideals are and what we think we've done. But ultimately, the more honest we are with that, and the more reflective we can be, I just think the profession benefits from it immensely. And I encourage and sort of will continue to seek the sort of to read those blogs and about the studies and listen to those podcasts where people do have that kind of thinking.
That was a big part of why I asked Rachel Ball and Shannon to take part in season 6, because they both are very keen to talk about what they're actually doing. Obviously I was asking them about general principles, but then it's what did those principles look like? And they were very, very keen to talk about where things had gone wrong. I almost asked them similar questions on some of their some of the sections of their episodes. And yeah, I mean, if you're looking for examples of people who talk about what they do, how they do it, look no further than Rachel and Shannon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Those two are definitely in the same way of thinking as I am, and I know you are, Kieran, and very tuned into the how. And I think, I think that's probably why I value them so highly as well, because they do that so well. And I think it's so important to be able to try and learn from others about, to try and help you, prevent you from perhaps making those mistakes, isn't it? It's like we do with children, isn't it? We try and look for misconceptions. We try to look at other models where perhaps things didn't work or have worked, but didn't quite, wasn't the optimum way of doing it or whatever, and learning from that and going, right, if we try and do that, maybe we can mitigate for that thing that I learned from that leader because X, Y, and Z, and I do, for me, that's smart leadership, that's intelligent leadership, and that's the way we should be as leaders, is reflective and not inward, but like outward looking, outward facing, and thinking, right, what did you do? How did you do that? Right. And not being egotistical about that, and sort of saying that actually we all do mess up sometimes, and sometimes we have these wonderful ideas and these, and we make them look great on social media, and we make them into a talk, and we do this and we do that, and sometimes they don't pan out in the long run to be the right thing. And because we're all making, it's cost benefit, we're all making decisions, aren't we, all the time in schools. The best decisions we can make is informed by the evidence, but also informed by the experiences of other leaders as well. And I think that's important to always take into account. Like, I'm not saying go fly blind, but consider the research, consider what others have done in the field as well that might have caused problems. And that's why I like learning from people like Shannon and Rachel and many others as well. That makes you a more reflective leader. So I kind of had that in my head when I was. I kind of feel like I've always had that in my head. That's kind of how I operate as a leader, right? It's part of my values in terms of trying to be honest about making mistakes and learning and listening to other people as well, and also trying not to invest too much of, because it's very easy for us as leaders and as people who speak at conferences and do other things like that, to invest ourselves into something very, very heavily, because we wholeheartedly believe it, and then for it to perhaps not turn out, like I said before, the way you hoped it had. Now, with the reading approach, this was something that it felt big. It just felt big. This did, like, this shift. And I mean, we've seen the kind of impact of Chris's book far and wide, and I feel like might have hedged my bet correctly, perhaps, on that one, by taking on board what he was saying and putting it to ground. And you said there about us doing a mixture of a mixture in our implementation. At that point, I hadn't quite refined our current model, which I might just touch on later. But we did, we were thinking of this reading implementation as a long, thin approach. We were thinking of it like that. It's just we didn't have the mechanism in place at that point like that we do now. But we did have a mechanism, as in our staff meetings, and we decided to commit time, a good chunk of time, to making sure this worked. Was very fortunate, and I know Chris shares these freely. It might be on his blog, but to have his instructional videos, and also the videos of him actually teaching the structured lesson. So the close read, the fluency read, the extended reads, those sessions are all filmed by him, and he shared those with us. So we were able to look at what a good one looked like, if you will, and our staff were able to like see it. And I mean, I was in training 2 weeks ago where we watched all those videos again with our mentors and our mentees, and it's one of the most priceless things you can do is commit things to video, and have a shared centrally stored area that is available wherever, not even in school and out of school, for people to be able to go back to and revisit things. And that was a huge part of it, helping our staff to feel like they were doing the right thing, because that's what people want to do. They want to feel like they're doing things right. That's how teachers like aim to please. I genuinely feel like that. I certainly did when I was teaching, and I know others, want to do a good job, and to have the ability to check back against a success criteria almost, like, and to check what were the active ingredients for a fluency read. Well, I'm going to watch Chris do it again for 10 minutes, and then I'm just going to double check about against my practice and go, oh yeah, I forgot to reread that bit twice, because it's human for us to forget the odd thing or slightly change something and forget that you've changed it away from its core purpose. So having the ability to go back to something and refresh and revise, like Pep says, was really helpful in getting it to ground. So we spent time doing that. We also sort of phased it as well. And this was on Chris's advice as well at the time. This was prior to me really getting my teeth into implementation. He suggested that, we didn't just jump into the 3 sessions, the fluency read, the close read, the extended read. We just worked on the fluency read for like 2-3 weeks, and we reviewed it, and we came back and we shared teething problems, and, and then we scale. So that kind of scalability is really, really important to consider, like when you're laying things down, when things are going to ground. And that really helped manage our teachers' cognitive load, and their ability to process things, and, to automate some of that stuff as well in the classroom, because shifting teacher behavior is we know that from the research that is challenging. So that really, really supported the process, and having those like review points as well, and coming back and really being honest and reflective and saying, this one works, this one we're really struggling on the timing for this one, or and really refining things so that we got it to a point where everybody had it down pretty tight. But in terms of sort of how we do things now, there's a lot of similarities probably to that. There's a couple of changes in terms of the mechanisms, in terms of how we would continue to follow up, like using instructional coaching and so on. But at the time, I feel like we did okay, considering the climate we were in, and the fact that we had to, like I said, we had to move quite quickly with that, to make sure that, not just for Ofsted, but like that the reading offer was solid for our children, so that we could build the rest of our curriculum on that kind of cornerstone, if you will.
Nice. So it's you had the toothpaste, but you had a really old toothbrush, and you need to upgrade that toothbrush for it to be effective, if we're going to stick with the metaphor.
Exactly.
I mean, recently I have been thinking a lot about the last project I did, because we're replicating it in a different part of the country. And so I've been thinking about what advice I can give to the person who is now doing a similar role to what I was across my 3 schools. And the more I think about it, the clearer the distinction between things I would recommend other people do and things I would recommend people don't do becomes clearer and clearer, because you got this rose-tinted vision of how things went. You sort of, I don't know, you probably from an evolutionary standpoint have to cut out some of the stuff that didn't go particularly well. So I think the role of context in this, anyone listening and thinking, can I do exactly what Lloyd has done? And you're thinking, can I do exactly what Chris has done? That word doesn't exist, and it's a case of, talking about Rachel and Shannon, examples of implementation gone right and wrong, and how we can, take everything we see and then try and refine what we do. And that's how you get to that point where you can't remember the mistakes you made, because it becomes, like you say, the Staplehurst way. It becomes a part of who your identity as a school and as a leader. So, I'm almost thinking as you're speaking, if anyone else is in a similar position to you and they want to share their experience, it might be good to collate like a massive bank. So if anyone is keen to, just email me and say, I want to chat about our reading, the changes we made to reading, that would be really good, because I think, yeah, there is no one way to do this, but what you've done is you have taken several years to refine how you do it. Hopefully getting to the point where pupils are getting a really high quality reading education. And we know that given the demographic of your school, literacy levels are particularly important, because they can be, I don't know, not a societal blocker, but they can exacerbate certain things that are already prevalent. I don't know how best to describe that. And obviously, you're the expert in that field and your school's sort of catchment. So do correct me if I say anything that's probably, that is off the mark. But I think literacy is important for everyone, and the ability to read is important for everyone. But in certain instances, it can be extra important. So the next section that really stood out to me is one that I think it's a question that gets asked, but not necessarily asked a lot. And it says, we therefore assume that children looking at the rods, so Cuisinart rods, I think in this instance, and doing things with them, could see how the world of numbers and numerical operations worked. The trouble with that theory is that my colleague and I already knew how the numbers worked. We could say, oh, the rods behave just the way numbers do. But if we hadn't known how numbers behaved, would looking at the rods enable us to find out? Which is a really long way of saying we understand as teachers. So how much of our knowledge are we placing on the manipulatives? And do they actually have the capacity to support people's understanding, Cuisinart rods in particular?
I mean, and that does make loads of sense, doesn't it? The idea, I mean, we've all seen it in our own practice, where we think we are explaining something to pupils using a visual representation, using a manipulative, and even in some cases, kids kind of getting to the right answer using these things. We think, oh yeah, this is obviously conveying the information, this underlying structure of mathematics that I want them to get. And then afterwards, you realize that they're either just, they're almost using them as a calculator, or you say to them, I'll give you an example. I've had a situation where I've been working with base 10 and I've seen kids moving the base 10 around as they work out certain things. And then afterwards, I've gone up to them and said, okay, just to be really clear, and I hold up with a 10 rod and say, like, how many is this worth? And they can't tell me. And you just wonder if I hadn't gone and asked that question, I just assume, they've got the right answers in their book. And often what's going on here is these are kids who already have, the underlying understanding of place value, of mental arithmetic. I think I've taught them something more to buttress this understanding through the use of these manipulatives. And actually, all they've done is almost be pretending to use them, kind of going through the motions of using them, because that's what they see their peers doing. And I think we're probably prone to that as classroom teachers a lot more than we think. We assume that we've communicated this symbolic idea beautifully. And in fact, they're often, going through the motions in the same way as when you ask pupils something like, oh, okay, how many is this? And they start counting again because they haven't yet learned that, this idea of cardinality, and they just hear how many is that as an instruction to count them again. And so there's this connection you think is there between the language you're using and their understanding, but actually it isn't. They're just almost responding to it, like behavioristically. I think the same thing can happen with manipulatives sometimes, where there isn't this understanding in the black box of their mind. They're just somehow going from A to B and it looks right.
I mean, what you're saying ties up with something Clemens and Schramm have written about in the past, where there's this paper, now I'm going to butcher the name. I can't remember if it's Elizabeth or not. It's EH Fenema, and it's a paper from 1972, and it's a really well constructed, in my opinion, paper, and it suggests that Cuisinart rods are less effective in some instances than symbolic instruction. And the thing that gets overlooked sometimes about this research is that it was the prior knowledge and the experiential background of the pupils that made that possible. And I think where pupils do understand the mathematics, there's a case for manipulatives not being necessary, and it depends on how robust their schema are and how flexible they are with the information that they have. But there's definitely other papers and other pieces of research that would suggest that when pupils know things, then they're not necessarily going to be served by manipulatives. And I think, with reference to adults ascribing, the creation of meaning because they can see it, I think it's a definite possibility. Things like the bar model. When the bar model gets out of control, and we've got really, I know it's not necessarily a physical manipulative, but it is something you manipulate when you look at mathematical problems. When you've got all these weird and wonderful versions, how much help is it really going to be to a pupil? Is it going to be more helpful than underlining the important words and that kind of thing? I think, yeah. So I can see this. I think we do apply this, and I think it's borne out in some other research, particularly if you think about those pupils you already know, and it almost feeds into their first principle. Now I'm going to go through their principles in a bit, but the first two sort of ideas are tied together by the idea that we need a model with the manipulatives. These representations we create, they have a purpose, and we need to be very clear in our minds what it is we're trying to exemplify. Because something like Cuisinart rods, we always talk about how much time you need to spend getting to, playing with them, understanding the relationship between the different rods, and then you can use them to generalize. And so I think it's definitely, we need to be clear in our mind exactly what the purpose. I mean, it sounds like this is going to be the summary of every single thing. We need to be clear, but I think it's rule number one. Why are we using them? Because otherwise, who knows what the outcome will be.
What I love is sometimes you get teachers who, there was a teacher I remember kind of taught me a lesson about the purpose of the manipulatives. I went into their classroom and I was hoping I knew they were teaching place value. I was aware of their of like where they were up into this in the sequence, and they were talking about deans, etc. And I was hoping to go and see them actually modeling with the deans, using them, etc., getting the children to learn using them. And they opened up to me and said, we don't actually have enough, so the class next door are using them right now. I was like, oh, okay. And I noticed across the room that the kids were all using this notation, which was kind of sticks and dots. And I thought, oh, well, this is a really poor, replacement for that. And then I went around the room to all the kids and they said, oh, yeah, no, this stick, that's just because we don't have the tens right now. So this means a 10 and these dots mean ones. So look, let me show you. Line, dot, 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 dot. That's 34 because I've got 3 10s and 4 1s. And I thought, oh, okay. Okay, this is a teacher who understands what's going on here. So even though they didn't have the equipment at that moment, the teacher was totally fine with it because they were using a symbolic representation to show their understanding of 10s and 1s. And it didn't matter that it was the physical manipulative that they'd been using in the past. And what was lovely about it as well is that the teacher, I saw in the conversations they're having, they were saying to the kids like, oh yeah, I see you can recognize that's 34. But I wonder if you can now try that, that same thing where we're adding, 30 to 34. Try it without the picture you've got this time. Just see if you can add those 3 10s to 34. What do you think it'll be? And then you see the kids' cogs whirring. They go, oh, well, it's 64. And then the teacher says, well, do you think you needed to draw it? And the kid's like, I could draw it, but nah. And it's lovely because there's something about a teacher who just inherently gets this idea that representations and manipulatives are a way to get to the mathematics rather than that they're a tool rather than just something to use. And dare I say, that was not a hugely experienced teacher. It was just someone who kind of got manipulatives and what they were for, what visual representations were for. So yeah, it's always nice to share a story about a teacher who really gets it.
It actually speaks to something that doesn't get mentioned in this paper, but the Clements and Trauma have mentioned before, and I sort of did some digging on it. It's the idea that the more salient a resource, the more difficult transfer might be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's the paper they talk about? I've got it. It's called Dual Representation and the Linking of Concrete and Symbolic Representations. Now, I really hope that's the real paper. Certainly in my notes, that's the one that I have attributed this study to. But I'm sure you've heard me bang on about it before. They took a toy Snoopy and put it in a doll's house in a room. And they put a teddy bear Snoopy in the same room in a real house. And basically, the children who were asked to find the teddy Snoopy, and they couldn't. And their conclusion was that the representation had been too salient. You know, it was too real. That they
and by what when you say too salient, I'm probably going to be misconstruing what's going on here. But in effect, if perhaps they put a Snoopy in a toy house, if perhaps it had been not a Snoopy, or if it had been a picture of the house, or how could it have been less salient in order to be more effective in this case? Just so I wrap my head around it.
Good point. I mean, yeah, I'm thinking of a picture, and two-dimensional version of a house. Those dolls' houses that have the front come off, and then maybe like a little circle. They would have been able to find it if you put an X there, because children are all pirates, and they would have known exactly where to go to find the treasure. And yeah, so maybe. I mean, in the classroom, it's easier to describe this because it's, when do we use cupcakes and when do we just use counters to represent cupcakes, that kind of thing. Yeah. That's a good question. That's by Doherty, Newland, Hand, and Deloach. Maybe they're going to get an email from us to see what.
Well, I guess the idea of the salience in this case is, you put Snoopy in a doll's house, and then you say, "Oh, can you use this to find, Snoopy in your classroom?" You're like, "Well, no, he's already here in the doll's house," because it isn't. This little Snoopy isn't representing a Snoopy. It is Snoopy. I know it sounds, but I assume that's the kind of the point that they're making, that it's harder to make that symbolic reference when the thing you're using a symbol is so close to the real thing itself. Whereas if you distance yourself from it, you make it a counter, or you make it an X marks the spot, or whatever it might be, it's more apparent that this is standing for something rather than this being the thing itself. I hope that's the point. If it isn't, then I haven't understood at all.
No, I mean, that certainly sounds like that's the point. And I think it's a really good way of describing it. Yeah, because kids going to be all, there he is. Job done, research over. You guys can go home early now. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like I say, I really hope that's the right paper, because it's been a long time since I prepped for that talk, my guiding principles about research. But because lots of year 2 teachers in particular will say they can do it with the manipulatives, or they can do it with, the resources, but they can't do it in their books, which is shorthand for, they can't transfer this to sort of symbolic notation. And it might be that whatever's happening is too concrete. And that might speak to the idea that they're being used as calculators as well, because you're literally got that one-to-one correspondence with everything. Then you're going to struggle.
And speaking to the point you made before as well, when I've taught with manipulatives in the past, and when I was quite new to manipulatives and like really a big fan of them, I had circumstances where I had the reverse, where in effect we were doing, say, 2-digit add 2-digit addition mentally, and I've got a kid in the room who can just do it. It's like, well, 37 add 64 is 101. It's like, oh, okay, but can you show me with the manipulatives? And they just couldn't, because they're like, well, why? I know the answer. And yeah, so you sometimes can end up trying to force the reverse, as if to say, look, I'm really keen on manipulative, so play the game with me on this one, kid. And yeah, I obviously regret that.
And so you should, because being able to show, I don't know, I'm not really sure what that demonstrates. Really, you're asking them to demonstrate their reasoning, but there's a time and a place, and it's not all the time and every place.
Yeah, and even then, I suspect these kids could have spoken through their reasoning. They could have said, oh, well, 60 and 30 is 90, 7 and 4 is 11, and then, 90 and 10 and 1 is 101. I'm always terrified, by the way, when I do mental arithmetic, like off the top of my head on the podcast, because you just have to have one slip and you make yourself sound like a fool. So do check me back on this one and then delete it if I've made a fool of myself. Or turn up the volume, knowing you.
Yeah, on repeat.
Make it the cold drop at the start of the episode. Lovely.
Actually, I always do check the mental maths, and sometimes I've cut out lengthy pauses while people have worked out things. So if anyone's keen to go back and find examples of those, we'll give a free copy of The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading to anyone who finds an example of mental maths in a previous episode. And that goes across all guests, not just Chris.
All guests. I need to get myself some more copies.
I mean, the last thing for me that I've got on this is that the whole salience idea brings in our understanding or our deployment of what's known as pre-structured resources. And essentially, Dinesh equipment or base 10 equipment is an example of a pre-structured resource. Numicon will be pre-structured as well, because its physical existence makes it what it is. So, for instance, when we're exchanging 110 for 10 ones, at some point, there's a sleight of hand where you go, all right, kids, ignore this 10, here are 10 ones instead. Whereas if you use virtual manipulatives, like on MathSpot, you just lasso 110, press the exchange button, and you get 10 ones. And so there's actually, even though it's really concrete, it's slightly less mathematically accurate, I think. Same with geoboards, perhaps, because you're never truly representing, even though it is more physical. I don't know if geoboards count as pre-structured resources, but if you make a circle digitally, all the points will be equidistant from the midpoint. And so, so it's worth thinking, my take from the whole salience, does it help people understand the mathematics, is the idea that virtual manipulatives have a purpose, have the backing of quite a few research papers in this area. And so, I think that's where I got to. And I think it's where Clemens and Sarama got to too. But I was reading the research in their references in one of their papers. So, well done me for getting to the same place that they got to.
Yeah, it's interesting because often we think of manipulatives and saying, well, the thing is you have to be able to touch them. You have to physically interact with them. And I definitely think there's value, particularly if we're talking about early mathematics, of pupils interacting with all sorts of objects in a meaningful way in order to develop an understanding of number. But when it comes down to, teaching unfamiliar mathematical concepts, that manipulate is more about being able to do stuff with rather than, physically handle in a lot of cases. And as you say, digital manipulatives offer so much more flexibility in certain circumstances. If it's not just, the speed with which you can, say, decompose a 10 into 10 ones. I mean, I know you can stick together 10 ones using blue tack. I've done it under a visualizer to say, look, here's a 10, here's one I made earlier. And like you say, doing the sleight of hand. But with digital stuff, being able to, draw around it, that's 13. It looked like 13 ones, but watch it automatically assemble into a 10 and a 3 is, not something you can do quite so easily with the physical version. So, big fan of MathSpot. What's the American one? Is it, I want to say Maths Resources? Maths Learning Center. That's a really good American. So that, combining that with MathSpot and looking at the strengths and weaknesses of both is, the two that I relied on more than any.
I mean, actually, this feeds right into possibly the standout quote from the paper. I mean, actually, I think it's a quote that they've made too, but it's the standout in both papers if true. Understanding does not travel through the fingertips and up the arm. So you're talking there about the idea that it's not necessarily about touching things. That's they literally go on to say that teachers need to reflect on their students' representations and help them develop increasingly sophisticated and mathematical representations. I mean, the example that I like to give people is a 5-frame with 2 yellow counters and 1 red counter, and then ask them what's represented by this representation. And every group I give this to, totally different set of answers. I mean, there's some stock answers. You've got the addition of fractions, you've got subitizing, you've got composition of number with sort of small numbers. But I've seen some weird, wonderful ways of interpreting that representation, and it just goes to show that my point that I always make is that meaning is constructed with, not by, the manipulatives. I think that's essentially what they're driving at, is the idea that you could have the perfect, I don't know, explanation of completing the square using algebra tiles, but that doesn't guarantee that people's going to understand it. Maybe that's a bad example. Just goes to show that we need to be really purposeful about what we do. Oh my goodness.
Yes, it does indeed.
How is this possible? It's not even planned. Sorry. Indulge my desire to say there needs to be a purpose. That's basically the central theme. What are your guiding principles for leading from the middle?
I think that there's a whole range of things that we want to consider if we're going to be effective in this role, if we're going to be effective at leading from the middle. And some of these are kind of high level sort of thinking about the overall structure, the overall vision, the direction of the department and also the school, and others are more specific. So I think I'll try and give you just a general sense just now of some of these kind of principles. And for me, I think it boils down to, an aim. You want to set an aim. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve in this mathematics department or with this group of mathematics teachers in the school? What do we want to do for the students? And so I think it's really important that either collaboratively or you do this yourself and then take it to the team, that we set an aim and that we know why we've chosen this as our aim. Because if we don't know why we're doing it, then who's going to subscribe to that and why should we bother? So there needs to be a really sort of clear kind of rationale that wins over, and that not only wins over but really appeals to the hearts and the minds of everybody on your team. So set an aim is critical, know why it's your aim, and then develop a set of key objectives that are designed to meet that aim. And then I think anything that you do should fulfill those objectives and therefore be pushing you toward your aim. Because if not, if things that we're doing in the department, in the classrooms across the school, that don't fulfill those objectives, then they're probably not taking us towards our aim. And so they're either the wrong thing or our objectives need to change. So I think setting an aim and knowing why it's your aim and having some structured objectives to work toward that aim are critical.
Where do we get our aims from? Because I quite often have the conversation, where do I go for inspiration? How do I know what good quality mathematics teaching or just teaching in general looks like? Where does that come from? Because obviously if you're engaged in reading about our craft, if you're reading about education, research, these things start to tick over. But how do I land on this is what my ideal is for mathematics, this is what my ideal is for the quality of teaching? Is it something that develops over time, or can we take deliberate steps? Okay, I'm a novice middle leader. I need to know more. I want to find my own vision. What do I do?
You might find that your aim could change over time as the department moves from one stage to the next, depending on the personnel and depending on where it's at just now. But like I said before, I think the aim should be something that's quite high level. And so without getting into the real specifics of what are those objectives and what does highly effective teaching look like, the aim is going to be something like, provide the highest quality educational experience that we can, so that all students are able to achieve success in school mathematics, for example. And the reason that we're doing that, the why of that, is because we owe it to them. It is our role in society to help the next generation be equipped in the best way that we possibly can for life beyond school, for work and for life in general. So that when I'm talking about aim, I'm talking about something as kind of high level as that, which I think anyone can probably subscribe to. The objectives will be harder depending on your level of knowledge and expertise, and then actually the real nuts and bolts about what are we doing in the department to meet these objectives or to push us towards these objectives, again, we can probably touch upon a little bit later. One thing that crossed my mind when you mentioned that was reasonably recently I've been talking about curriculum, and as part of that I did some research into various different curricula in the UK and beyond. And whenever you find a curriculum document produced by an education department or whoever it is, they basically are all the same. They all start with the same sort of spiel, which is about, encouraging, or not even encouraging, a curriculum that supports young people in becoming confident with mathematics and enjoying mathematics, and being able to make decisions that are going to allow them to live a better and sort of more successful life. So almost every curriculum that you read about has that sort of aspirational aim. And that is a source of inspiration for us as well. But what's really kind of interesting is what is sometimes missing is the how. So there's the aim, and we kind of get the why, but where's the how? What comes after in most curricula is a list of bits of maths that need to be taught, and there's maybe some little disconnect. So I don't know. That's just my take. And that's something that middle leaders need to think about with their teams is, how are we actually achieving those aims?
A very polite way of saying you've misinterpreted what I said, Kieran. So I appreciate your kindness.
Another guiding principle for middle leaders is to do with time. And I think that, sometimes I put this last when I'm talking about effective middle leadership, but it's probably the most important thing, is that we understand that there will always be more work to do. And you don't have to do it all. What we want to do is we want to make sure we focus the available time that we have, the limited time that we have, on the tasks, the initiatives, the actions that are going to make the most impact, i.e. the things that will help us fulfill those objectives that I talked about earlier on. So we've got this clear structure, and the things that we're spending our time on, we need to continually ask ourselves, is this helping me fulfill an objective that I've set for the department? So for me, objectives might be improved teacher efficacy. And then if I'm sitting sort of spending hours and hours writing emails to parents or whatever that might be, is that improving teacher efficacy? So yeah, there's admin to do, but we want to think about how we're spending our time. So time is limited. There'll always be more work. So focus on the things that matter. It's okay not to do everything. The school will open the next day, children will arrive, and they'll have learned something and they'll learn more the next day. Remember that nobody performs well when stressed for extended periods of time. Humans are not designed to be stressed for extended periods. Our bodies can cope with momentarily being stressed, and we respond, and we need to calm down again. It is no good to be exhausted. You're no good to anybody. You've got a finite amount of time and energy, so use it to work on the things that support the aim.
Sometimes our goals or objectives for whatever subject we're leading can be tied to our accountability processes. I mean, more often than not, probably. And then there's also the phenomenon of the sunk cost fallacy. How easy did you find it to discard ineffective practices, particularly in keeping in mind that admission that things aren't working might then have a negative impact on your, performance review or whatever it is that happens every year?
To be honest, I think that I didn't find it too difficult to discard things that aren't working, which might sound strange. I appreciate the sunk cost fallacy. You know, we've spent a lot of time creating this thing. We've put a lot of effort into making this. We've been running this initiative for a certain amount of time. Why stop? You know, keep going. We spent all this effort in it. But when things aren't working, people know things aren't working. That's coming to you in the form of feedback from students, from parents, from other teachers and colleagues, or from SLT, or even if you just picked up on that yourself. If it's not working, it's not working. So we should be open and honest and address that, because that type of climate or that culture is very healthy. If people are able to sort of discuss how successful things are being and actually be able to take that step back and say, well, okay, are there alternatives? When is the time to, you know, seriously consider switching to an alternative? You know, that's a disposition that learning mathematics teaches you, is when you're faced with a problem and you're trying to solve it using one approach. Somewhere down the line, if that's not the correct approach, you have to stop. You have to back up and you have to think about an alternative approach. And so, you know, your point about sort of performance review and appraisals and things like that is valid. But for me, I would hold in much higher regard an individual who was able to stop and say, we thought this would work, we tried this. We then had measures in place that gave us the feedback to say it wasn't working as we expected. We reviewed, we refined, it still didn't work. So we took it right back to the drawing board and we've gone with this instead. And for me, that's the person I want on my team.
I mean, you're getting the full Paxman treatment. I apologize that it's gone fully news night. But I know that whenever whenever Kate and I talk about something, and you know, it's on a school improvement thing, and think, well, we've got too much to do, I find it really easy to make a list of things and go, we can cut this, and she doesn't necessarily, and so it makes me think that maybe there are lots of people who are thinking, you know, this isn't an easy process. So it's worth thinking. You know, I think you're very clear in terms of how you might go about it. But I thought it was worth asking, you know. So it's special privileges because we talk every day. You're getting the harshest treatment, you know.
I appreciate it. No, I do. And I'm looking forward to this 5-hour episode when it gets released.
Well, Johnny and Dave would be very disappointed if it was anything less than 5 hours, wouldn't they?
I don't want to let them down. I was talking there about time, but you know, another sort of way of viewing time is through efficiency. And we know that maths teams, maths departments have limited time together. And so I think it's really, really important to make the most of that time. We want to make sure that we are aiming for consistently high standards of teaching across the whole of the team. And to do that, we need to make sure that departmental meetings are efficient and that they're focused on doing exactly that. We want to make sure that we are using as much of the available time that we have together to improve teacher efficacy and not to be dealing with sort of tedious admin that can be done in a different way. I also think it's really important when we're talking about efficiency is to look at the use of our own time and consider how we are using our limited free time. And you know, I say free time, but there isn't any free time in a school really, but non-contact time, how we're using that to, again, try and meet the aim and try and fulfill the objectives that are going to take us to the aim. And for me, a big part of that is supporting colleagues in improving. And then I think a final guiding principle for just now is to do with expectations. And this is interesting because it just directly mirrors what you do with the class. When you're working with a group of pupils, there's a process of expectation setting, and you know it's key as a teacher, and especially when I work with early career teachers or teachers who are maybe sort of more novice. They maybe have in their head what they think is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Sometimes they haven't even got as far as really being clear in their own mind what it is that we want to set in terms of expectations. Never mind how are we going to try and ensure that they're met, and what is the result if they're not met. So I think really important that middle leaders develop their own sense of what expectations are in terms of teaching and in terms of learning, in terms of professional development, and that these are communicated very clearly to the team. We want to be very clear in what we expect to see in lessons. maybe we can explore later on this idea of, should we have non-negotiables? Should middle leaders insist on certain things to take place in lessons? I know that'll be causing the hair on the back of some people's necks to rise at the moment, but I think I can form an argument as to why some things should be considered to be non-negotiable. And we need to also know, in sort of under that heading of expectations, we need to also know where our thoughts and where our thinking sits on the sort of scale of the scale between giving teachers full autonomy to just go and do their thing and be great, and ensuring consistency in terms of the high standards of teaching and learning. And the extreme end of that is the centralized PowerPoint and making every teacher has to click through the same slides and use the same set of prescribed tasks. So there's decisions to be made in there, and then there's expectations to be communicated. So I think those are probably the guiding principles that I see as most important. Have an aim, set an aim, work towards that aim, think about your time, focus on doing the things that make the biggest impact and that take you toward your objectives. Be efficient in the sense of make the most of your time with colleagues, try and focus on improving departmental meetings, and then expectations, be clear in your own mind and communicate to colleagues the expectations that you have in terms of what you want to see in lessons, what we do in this department, and where you sort of sit on this scale, this tricky scale between consistency and full autonomy.
Are you going to mention non-negotiables later on, or can we get into it now? Because whenever I heard that, I was like, In my experience, maybe it could just be a terminology thing. Non-negotiables, to me, more often than not, seems like a proxy for poor leadership, in as much as there's not really an understanding of the fact that maths lessons will differ depending on where you are in a sequence. And we've talked about before the lesson not being the unit of measurement, and the idea that what I'm doing, if I'm doing a lot of instruction today, it might be tomorrow that I ask pupils to practice. We just pick up where we left off. Non-negotiables are quite often, I want to see this in every lesson, and I want to see this every day. And when I walk into classes, I want to see this, rather than here are the things we think feature in effective teaching. If I don't see it today, well, maybe I'll see it down the line, and it's a bigger picture kind of thing, because I know where you're coming from. You want to hear the practices we think are informed by evidence and have the best chance of supporting people's learning. What's your argument for non-negotiables? Because that's my interpretation of that, and maybe it is that we just need a different name for it.
Yeah, my interpretation lines up with what you've described there. So you could be right in the sense that it's just a sort of naming convention in here. There are things that I need to see over a period of time, that teachers need to be doing over a period of time. So going into a lesson with a clipboard and a checklist is not at all what I'm encouraging here in any way. But there certainly are things that I feel do have a place in not necessarily every single lesson, but the very, very large majority of lessons should feature certain elements. I know that we've discussed like a mathematical idea not fitting neatly into a 50-minute lesson or whatever that is, and that lesson 2 may well just pick up on where lesson 1 was. So the whole idea of 5 a day and everybody has to do a starter or a retrieval starter with 4 quarters or whatever, and that's whole school policy. And I know that happens. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. And I think when we do dig into non-negotiables or minimum expectations, I don't know, maybe that's a better term. We dig into that a little bit more later on. Hopefully that'll become clearer.
Yeah, so no scrap, unfortunately. I'm just waiting for that big tete-a-tete that'll make the podcast really break through. But unfortunately, this time it was not to be, because it was a very it is just the term non-negotiable, because people have interpreted it and then been really, every lesson must have 3 parts, every lesson must, which is seemingly what we do in education. We take things very, very literally, but hopefully not if we spend time thinking. I think the listeners know I love going to Research Ed. One of the best things about it is a chance to listen to really smart people share their views. And I think it was very start of March in Warrington, I was lucky enough to catch your session, and I thought it was fantastic. And you mentioned your preference for a mechanisms first approach to teacher professional development. What does this entail, and why not define PD by, for instance, form or characteristics?
It's a good question, Kieran. I mean, I'm gonna try not to make this a 3-hour podcast because you've started me off on a question that I think I could talk about all day. So I think like characteristics I want to start with, because if you look back historically at the research, because I think we should be informed by the best bets from what literature suggests. If you look what the research says about effective PD, historically you've got reviews like Timperley et al., Desimone 2009, Cordingley et al. 2015. And these sort of looked to synthesize and bring together kind of the best available evidence about PD programs that worked and PD inputs that worked, like what makes great PD. And they kind of narrowed in on a kind of consensus of traits or characteristics or features of PD that made it tick. So it's things like PD should be sustained over time. PD should be collaborative. PD should be focused on teaching and learning content. It should draw on external expertise. You should have some active learning. I'm not sure what that means, but active learning to use or practice or apply what's learnt. And like these all feel kind of relatively sensible and reasonable. But the problem is that a lot of these historical reviews are correlational. So they look at what PD programs were highly effective from research, and they say what features did they have? And then they draw this kind of consensus of those common features. But the problem is that, you know, as a scientist by background, a science teacher by background, you should be careful there. You know, correlation is not causation. The fact that these PD programs had these features didn't mean that that's what made them tick or made them effective. They could be present in all these programs, but causally redundant. They might not be the thing that leads to any impact. And the example I always give is, well, like collaborative. It looks like loads of the PD programs that run and that are effective are collaborative. Well, that might be true, but they might just all be collaborative because that's a really efficient and cost-effective way to design PD. Like it's much cheaper to design a PD program with one teacher educator standing at the front and then 30 or 60 teachers sitting in front of them than it is to have one-to-one PD. So often PD just gets designed in a way that's collaborative or large group settings in order to kind of reduce costs. And if all the PD programs or majority of them have been designed like that, then it sort of stands to reason that, yeah, like a bunch of the ones that are really effective will be collaborative, but possibly also a bunch of the ones that are ineffective will also be collaborative. It's just something that tends to happen in every PD program. So like I find it quite, I think it's quite risky to draw a conclusion from that we should make PD that's collaborative. It doesn't tell us whether it's a good or bad thing. So that's kind of characteristics. And I think, again, these characteristics of PD are like very descriptive, but they're not very informative. They can't tell us that these things are impactful. The other thing you mentioned, like forms, is another way of like trying to codify what makes great PD. And so a form of PD is like a label or a sticker, like a wrapper on like a package. So for example, you might talk about instructional coaching or teacher learning communities or lesson study. And those are kind of labels that wrap up a whole load of stuff that's happening with a big title and says, you know, this is what we're labeling our PD with. Here, there's a kind of another problem, right? And it's called the jingle fallacy, which essentially refers to when you have two or more people using the same term to refer to things that are actually different under the surface. You know, to give the example of, let's say, instructional coaching. When I say instructional coaching and someone else says instructional coaching, like how do we know we're thinking about exactly the same thing? And I almost guarantee that in, you know, majority of settings, if you ask people to say who would tell you they're doing instructional coaching to discuss and compare precisely how they've done that in their school, often there'd be maybe some small differences, maybe some big differences, right? So the risk of this, these forms or these labels, is that they sort of suggest that they represent shared language, but the risk is that that shared language isn't actually shared, and they're labels that mean actually under the surface quite different things. So in 2021, the EEF set up a team to essentially explore like what we might be able to know about the aspects of PD that make it effective. And they put together a report into a guidance report into effective professional development. And in that, they sought to sort of unpick what might be called in medicine active ingredients. So in pharmaceutical companies, they will call the active ingredient of a product the thing that makes it work. So, for example, in the analogy often given is toothpaste. In toothpaste, you've got the characteristic. The toothpaste is kind of white and probably minty flavored, unless you're American, in which case it might be cinnamon flavored, which sounds awful. The form is the package, and it's got a nice label on it with some pretty writing. But the mechanism, the active ingredient, sorry, is sodium fluoride. And if you take out the sodium fluoride, the toothpaste is no longer any good at preventing cavities. Likewise, this team sought to really dig into the research and distill what are the active ingredients and what they've called mechanisms of teacher professional development. What are the things that cause it to have an impact upon not just teacher learning, but actually ultimate pupil learning? And that was a key aspect of the research. They didn't just look for teacher behavior change, they looked for impacts upon student outcomes. And they distilled down 14 of these mechanisms, which then become kind of causal and replicable and essential in PD, to say, here are the things that we believe from this kind of really rigorous exploration of the literature have a causal impact on, I said, ultimately kind of the outcomes for children. There's 14 of these. There's a whole variety of them, and people can go and look these up on the EF's website, but they're things like goal setting, feedback, action planning, modeling. And in that case, we're talking about CPD, right? So when we say modeling, we're saying a teacher educator in a CPD session modeling something to teachers. It's not referring to like teachers modeling in the classroom. It's specifically the moves that a teacher educator might make in a CPD session. The conclusions of this paper was that out of these 14, the more that are present, the greater the ultimate pupil learning. And they had a quite kind of like rigorous deep dive into this. There's a evidence summary that underpins the main paper that I really recommend people read as well. But it's great because it's really exciting for me when it first came out, and it's still as exciting to me now because it gives us, okay, here are the bits that make PD tick. Here's how we can think about squeezing more juice, getting more power out of our PD efforts, and hopefully in a more efficient way, if we can kind of bundle lots of mechanisms in at the same time, we can create like really impactful PD that's going to like really pack a punch and give us value for money.
You may have already touched on this, but what are some of the benefits to school or trust leaders to taking that mechanisms first approach?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I didn't make that clear. So that's a really good push. I think the risk of going for, in particular, a forms approach to PD, so labels like instructional coaching or lesson study or teacher learning communities, is that school leaders might feel the sort of pressure or even seduced by the idea of saying, well, if we bring this thing in that's supposed to be good or great, we can replace our existing PD systems and we'll have much more impact. And there's a real risk to that, right? I mean, firstly, there's the opportunity cost of just spending lots of time having to overhaul, tear down existing structures, bring in new systems and procedures, train and develop staff on how to use and engage in those systems. So there's a lot of time involved in that. There's also like a motivational and kind of buy-in impact to that. If you spent the last few years working on an existing kind of in-house PD setup, and now you're asking teachers to change tack and say, yeah, you've put lots of effort and energy into kind of understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it with our existing processes, but we now want you to sort of learn and buy into and engage in a sort of new way of working. Again, I think there's quite a lot of potential cost in terms of the time and energy you're asking of teachers there, teachers who are incredibly busy. And I think on the other hand, if we think about a mechanism first approach, and again, we sort of like look at our kind of menu of 14 mechanisms, we can do something quite cool, which is teachers can look at, or school leaders can look at their existing CPD offer and say, right, we're currently doing these things to support teachers to develop on an ongoing basis. Like, which mechanisms are currently present? So you might look and think, well, currently I'm doing instruction. So we're teaching teachers some new approaches, we're sharing some new strategies with them. We're doing action planning, we're asking to plan ahead to their lessons when they're thinking about these new ideas. We're giving social support, we're setting up buddy systems maybe. That's quite a cool one, I think, using buddies for social support, or even doing collaborative action planning, where teachers could tick that box as well. We're doing feedback, so teachers are giving each other peer feedback on their planning. And we're doing goal setting, so maybe they set themselves a little personal action plan at the end of the PD. So rather than taking that and saying, well, I'm going to replace it with lesson study, or I'm going to replace it with teacher learning communities, we might think, well, hang on, I've already got, what was that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mechanisms in there. Now, the literature suggests that we can avoid overhauling that completely and ripping it down and planning from scratch, but actually we could tweak and adjust our existing approaches by saying, right, which mechanisms have we got, which mechanisms aren't present, and then think, well, how can I bring in some of my missing elements in a way that is integrated and coherent with my existing approach? So in my example, kind of at the start, I think I said that you might start with the instruction mechanism, which is you introduce a new strategy, you talk about how it works to teachers. Well, maybe after that, we want to do some modeling. So rather than just explaining a new strategy to teachers, we might want to model it to them, show them how it looks. So that could be a live model delivered by the teacher educator, or it could be showing a video of it in practice. And then you could drill down on that and start to discuss, well, what elements are here? What's the purpose of those elements? And so on and so forth. Another mechanism that's missing from the example I gave, I think, is revisiting prior learning. So you might want to start your session off by saying, right, well, everyone look back to our previous staff meeting and think about the strategy or the step you set yourself to work on from then. Like, how's it gone? Like, what were your successes? Where were the areas that you still are kind of grappling with? And they can discuss with a kind of partner and get some kind of feedback from their partner. So I hope it kind of makes sense that you can take this approach and instead of just ripping things up and saying, well, I need to just bring in a new label or a new form, we can start to think really deeply and critically about the different elements of our PD offer in a school and like tweak and hone those by thinking really carefully about what's the purpose of these, what function are they serving, what mechanisms present here. And then, of course, you then do even cooler things by saying, right, well, I'm currently doing setting goals by having teachers write a personal action plan. Can I do that setting goals mechanism with even more kind of granularity or even more nuance? Likewise, with kind of modeling, you can do really exciting things with models to, again, like squeeze loads of juice out of that limited time available.
I think it sounds really appealing to school leaders because one of the things I've noticed across many, many schools is that the only constant sometimes is change. And if you can avoid that reset, then, I think it sounds like a very valid approach, and one that, with like you say, with a big investment of time, maybe it's a very difficult thinking session that you go through, maybe a couple of hours with your, I don't know, senior leaders or those leaders who are going to be driving the change forward. You can then get bigger gains as you go through. So, as a former school leader, I'm thinking, yes, this avoids having to establish why we should do this new thing, which is quite often one of the most difficult things you can do as a leader.
And I think teachers get initiative fatigue, right? They're tired a lot of the time of every year in September, a brand new initiative being introduced, whether that's about teaching, learning, or staff development. And they think, hang on, what about the thing we introduced last September? Can we not finish doing that or get better at doing that? And old initiatives sometimes, unfortunately kind of get slowly kind of phased out and we stop talking about them or they get kind of swept under the rug. And so I think ultimately it's a question of how do we think about how we deliver our in-house PD, which again I think is my push, is there's huge benefits for doing in-house PD, but there are significant limitations upon the time teachers have to engage in that over the course of a working week. There's so much teachers have to do. So how can we do it really efficiently? And I suppose at this point it's worth mentioning one of my bugbears is when talking about the ES mechanisms is there's a kind of assumption that each mechanism has like a one-to-one interaction with an input of PD. So first I'm going to start my session off by doing my instruction mechanism. Then I'm going to do my modeling. Then I'm going to do my action planning. And I think actually the most effective PD offers have, at any one given time, any one given section of a PD session, have got multiple mechanisms happening at the same time, which again gives you great efficiency, even more power in terms of potential impact. And you can speak to that efficiency question, which of course is really present in the minds of senior leaders with that limited time available for staff development for those kind of staff meetings or CPD sessions.
I mean, knowing how we enjoy compartmentalizing our lessons into different sections, I can see how that's a natural place to go. So, as promised last week, special Christmas games edition. Well, maybe that's given the I don't know, the plot line away, but it's
game away.
I was trying not to
Mate,
say
I thought you would. I literally thought you were joking. I was like, "Is he?"
But a bum.
Given maybe that's giving the game away, but we're thinking about engaging parents, carers, anyone who's at home with kids in mathematics or with mathematics. And I think probably the first thing to think about, because it can be a substantial time investment, and I'm going to throw this your way, Shannon. Why should we try to engage parents or carers with mathematics at home?
My biggest reason would be because I have sat through countless parents' evening appointments where the parents have said, "Oh, I'm not a maths person. They're not mathsy. Oh, I'm much more of an English person." They're like their dad. Their dad's into maths. And I just think we need to eradicate all of that talk. And by getting parents engaged and by getting them, talking maths, doing maths, problem solving, playing games, all of those things, we'll try and break down those barriers that some adults have. I think we have probably so many adults who are a similar age to us or older who had a really bad time at with maths at school, and for whatever reason it wasn't taught as effectively as I think we're teaching it now. It certainly wasn't broken down, and we didn't kind of delve into the conceptual side of things very much. And so I think lots of people have that wall up against maths, and we need to I think to get children on board, we have to get the parents on board, because so much of what the children say and do comes from what they hear at home, what they experience at home. And if they're hearing, "I'm not a maths person," then they're hearing it's okay to not be a maths person, and therefore they might not be engaging in class. So I think if we break down that barrier, increase parents' confidence with maths, we're therefore going to increase the children's kind of involvement with maths. And then we can start developing their kind of understanding around the resources that we use, the strategies we use. And I just think it will make for a happier place, a happier world, if everyone is engaging in math.
Yeah, I'll sort of echo what Shannon's saying there. It was the first thing on my list, so I crossed it off. No, it's spot on. What I think the only thing I'd add to it is, like, it's funny, isn't it? It's like people don't go, you say, you hear it so often, then you're like, "Oh yeah, I'm not very good at maths." No, nobody says, "No, I can't read for toffee. I haven't got a clue. Don't know what that says." You just don't hear adults saying that in the same way. Like, you just don't hear it. And like, why? Like, it's and that kind of like societal attitude towards maths, about the fact it's okay to be not good at maths. It needs shifting, doesn't it? And I guess at the heart of it, this is why we engage, isn't it? This is why we go out to engage. I think, like, fostering a love for maths at a really, really early age as well, and is really, really important, isn't it? I think why we try to get in, and particularly get in early with parents, really helps to sort of bring that on. And I know, like, maths is Kieran would be able to quote the research on this, but is like, obviously the success in early maths obviously leads to better outcomes later on in academic success, I believe, which so it's just a win-win, really, to promote maths early on, and to get in with parents to sort of. And I think what's really important as well is that kind of moving away from sort of giving information to communicating maths to parents. I think that's really, really important, and that we sort of work with parents, not to pitch it against, it's not us and them. It's that collaboration around engaging with parents.
It's really funny because in my notes, I've also got children who have a mathematically rich early years or more likely to have a positive experience later on. And then in brackets, I've put Kieran can explain the research for this one. So we're on the same wavelength here, Lloyd. I like this. I'm going to add one more thing before Kieran adds his ideas.
Over to Kieran with the research.
I think even those parents who are trying to engage with their children's maths learning at home maybe also just need to have something communicated. I liked what you said about, instead of delivering information, we're communicating the maths to the parents or with the parents, because I think that there is a tendency in parents to go to the procedural side of things and go for methods and writing things down too early. And as much as I was a child who loved it when my dad would write me a page of column addition and subtraction or multiplication division, when I got to that, there's something more to happen in between. There's a step that we're missing. And so I think if we can get parents on board understanding how we teach, so that we can focus on that kind of conceptual depth rather than procedural breadth, then we're going to be in a better place. And I think the relationship that we'll have with the parents then will become better as well, because often, I don't know about you guys, but I've had parents come in and say, I just don't understand how you're teaching it. That's not how we're doing it at home. And it's like this, like there's a confrontational element there, but it doesn't need to be that. It's about us working together and saying, oh, have you tried this? Or this is what we're trying to do at the moment. And quite often I'll send, if I ever have to send like homework home, and in the school that I work in at the moment, we send maths homework home. And I'll often say, I'll write a little note saying, you might be tempted to dive into column method here, but this is how we're doing it. And I'll try and give an example, because I really need them to be on board, and our parents are really on board, and they're really helpful at home, and they're happy to help, but we have to work with them. And I know that lots of schools have tried parent workshops and had kind of varying success with that, but just anything you can do, like those little notes home to say, try this way, this is what this means, this when it says use place value counters, this is what I mean, or deans, because quite often we're expecting, I think, the children to read that and go, I know what to do here, mum, don't you worry. So I think anything we can do to communicate the conceptual side as well is going to put us in a better place.
Just before Kieran comes in with a bit of research here, and probably even more erudite things to say, I do have a little bit of research to offer. Rhea in 2002, and I think this sums up exactly what you were saying, Shannon, said, unlike the harmonious anodyne relationship presented in many of the parental involvement texts, in reality, parent-teacher relationships are characterized by a struggle for control and definition. And I think that is exactly what you're hitting on there. It's that combative kind of like pitching that just leads to a breakdown, doesn't it? And I'm sure we'll delve into it later, but I thought that I just had to put that in because I think you sort of said exactly what that quote captured.
You just said you had that just ready to go. That is expert note usage. Oh yeah, there is one bit of research that I've got because no one told me they were throwing research my way to sum it up. And actually, slightly awkwardly, this is one of those things that I see many different presentations of the same idea. It's like early reading is the biggest determiner of X, and science results are the biggest determiner. And actually, I don't pay much heed to them. But there was a study that was published in 2021. Can't remember the group, but it was government funded. And essentially it looked at the impact of GCSE grades on potential future earnings. And the boundary between a C and a D in mathematics was essentially the pinch point. If you get a C, then everything opens up for you. If you get a D, then you're significantly disadvantaged, D and below, essentially. And so who was it? it was independent of the government, but it was government funded, and they were essentially just looking, because they're using C&D, so they're clearly looking at historic data to draw these conclusions. But yeah, I thought, yeah, essentially those people who are engaged with mathematics, because like you guys are saying, the whole, it's a much better experience if your early experience is better. Then you're going on to get decent qualifications, and then you're going on to sort of earn more in the long run. So that reason alone, I think. There was actually a conversation on Twitter about people saying I'm not good at maths. I can't remember. It was possibly one of the North American podcasters, either Zach Russell or is it Anna Stoka or Stocka? I know I'm going to mess up her name, but they were talking about how maths is important, but learning to read is more important. So maybe worth looking in the Twitter vault for that one, because they were actually discussing that. So, but I think, yeah, maths is, people who engage with mathematics, people who have decent qualifications in mathematics are likely to be successful, however you measure it, in their later lives. And so, for that reason alone, it's definitely worth engaging. And also the kids who do maths at home, who do things at home, like your rock stars and stuff like that, they come into year 4 knowing their times tables. I mean, I always take my oldest as an example, but he 15 minutes a day. I insisted that he did it, and between September and December, he learned them. And maybe he's atypical because he's got a maths expert-ish for a dad, but I didn't give him any guidance. I just said, do this for 15 minutes every day, a little and often, and that was it. And you see those kids in school, don't you?
Yeah, I've certainly got one in my class at the moment who I've put onto the next tables because they have mastered up to 12, but times 12. And I truly mean mastered. They're incredible. And so now they're looking at 13s and then 14s. And that's really exciting that I can do that. But that's, that's not every child, is it? But I think you're right. If they're engaging and they're doing those little and often things at home, they unlock an awful lot. And like you said, they go into year 4 knowing things. And it's not, I think it's not hard. I know people are busy. I know people work, but I think we can make time for the things that are important. And actually, anecdotally, my cousin, Naomi, shout out if you're listening. She won't be. She's not a teacher, but she has a child in I'm going to say year 3. And quite often she'll send me a message and say, Shan, is this kind of reasonable homework, or is this reasonable to expect this? And the last one was, logging into Times Table Rockstars. I think it was 5 times a week. The spelling program app, the online reading books as well that have been sent home, paper maths homework, or on Mathletics or something like that. And it was really adding up. And I just said, the thing out of this list, the things that I'm seeing that are important are the reading and the Times Table Rockstars. So do those. Like, her and her husband both work long hours, and they work in London, so they're getting the train back and they're kind of picking them up from after school club. But those are the things that I think those are the things that are the most important. I think reasonable people would agree. I think it's when we expect too much from our parents that they're just likely to disengage completely, and they won't even then try and do the Times Table Rockstars or the daily reading, because it all feels completely overwhelming, which is much like any human and the children that we teach, isn't it? I think we have to encourage their engagement and create an environment where they're going to engage with their children's mathematics learning. We have to think about, okay, so we're asking them to do this regularly, so what are we taking away? Classic of what, we do that whenever we think about new things that we're implementing or things that we think are important. And I think some places are missing the mark somewhat.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the boys' schools, they say, if you can't do anything else, do the spelling. And then everything else is a bonus on top of that, because we get here's a map of all these different rich tasks you can do. Choose 3 out of the next 4 or whatever that kind of thing. So yeah, so in the morning time, I get the boys ready, breakfast dressed, and then they learn Japanese at the minute on Duolingo, and they want to go straight to it. And I say, okay, you've got to do your spelling first, then you've got to do your maths, and then you can do your Duolingo. And so that they do 5 minutes each across all of those. And we, like I say, I think we're almost certain we're supported by the school in terms of, if it gets too much, because sometimes it does. We've had Sundays where the oldest wants it to be perfect, or the youngest isn't bothered and doesn't want to write a sentence, and so it can sabotage a whole afternoon. So I think you're absolutely spot on, Shannon. What are your guiding principles for coaching? Nice broad one to start.
So at Warrington, in fact, at the last couple of research ed events where I've spoken about professional vision, really it's under the caveat of discussing the purpose of coaching. So the premise really of that talk is there's an awful lot out there around, particularly currently, there's a lot out there around what coaching should and shouldn't look like. So what I would probably describe as the process of coaching, how to coach. The talk that I've been rolling out at the research ed events is it's more about why do we coach? What's the purpose? What's the point of doing it? And actually, the more I dig into coaching, and it's a big part of the work that we're currently doing our walkthroughs as well, the more purpose comes to the forefront, where you can go quite far in terms of implementing a successful or useful coaching program if there's a really clear understanding of why you're doing it in the first place. And for me, that comes down to developing the teacher's future responsiveness, their capacity to see the classroom in a really nuanced and detailed way, for them to notice things that are important. That people talk a lot about adaptive teaching and responsive teaching. And when you break that down, actually it comes down to you've got to see those things first. You've got to be able to look across the classroom and see what's happening, see what students are doing, in order to respond in an appropriate way. And I think that's a challenging thing. And so when we talk about the purpose of coaching, when I talk about the purpose of coaching, I'm talking about the idea of supporting that process. So building the teacher's capacity to be able to see things in their classroom that are important, to build their repertoire of teaching techniques that enable them to respond to the thing they've noticed, so they can be adaptive and responsive in the classroom. And the real key is that they're going to do that forever when you're not there. So the big kind of driver for purpose for me is the 99% rule. It's like, there's no statistics to back this up. This is a made up figure, but like, teachers are on their own for 99% of the time in the classroom, making their own decisions, doing their own thing. Nobody's there to help them. The coach isn't there. The senior leadership aren't there. And so what we do in coaching and what we do in professional development has to stick. The purpose is that when we're not there, the teacher's in a better position to see and deal with the things that are happening in the classroom than they were before the process started. So that's a big thing for me, is great coaching should be driven by a clear understanding of the purpose, what we're trying to get out of it, and not just what I see sometimes for various reasons, schools pretending to coach. So we employ a language of coaching. We talk about things as if that's what's happening, but the reality is we're just going through the motions. And sometimes there's a tendency to try and repair teachers, to kind of go into a classroom and see a lesson, and you're trying to fix what you've seen as opposed to thinking about what happens next. I don't know about you, Kieran, but I go through if I think back on my teaching career, I was in the classroom for 16 years before I came out to do this role, and I kind of feel that most of the feedback I ever got was about that moment in the lesson. It's like, this is what was seen, and this is what the observer felt was missing. So this is what's going to happen next. And I suppose the challenge with that is that moment's gone. It's like hitting a bad shot on a golf course. It's like you can't go back and hit it again. You've got to think about the next time I'm in that position, how am I going to deal with it differently? And so I feel that purpose is the number one guiding principle.
It's interesting you mentioned the 99%, because I almost in my time working with teachers, I noticed almost like because we're tired, because we're busy, there's almost like this slippage back to default.
Yeah.
And your aim is to make that default that, reasonably effective or highly effective mode of operation. Do you think that the purpose goes a long way to preventing that, or is it high quality coaching over a longer period of time? Well, have you experienced that before yourself?
I think it's a great point. So what you see when the purpose isn't transparent or where it's misaligned is you see a speed camera teaching. So you see teachers who change their plan or change their approach because Kieran's just walked in through the door and there's a need to be seen to be doing things. And I think that's a real challenge. And what I will say is I find there's a large part of that is unavoidable. It's human nature, because a teacher might have been working hard on something and it's only natural to want to showcase what you've been working on. And so there's a cultural thing there. First of all, you have to get the culture right where everybody knows that we're doing this thing because we want to make things better for the children in the end. So of course it relies on a long-term successful coaching program to help that to kind of come to fruition. But it's how do you avoid that kind of that change in behavior, that kind of change of dynamic when the coach walks through the door? How do you know that when you leave the classroom or the coaching conversation ends, that the teacher's going to go and choose to do that thing? And what you mentioned is spot on. The teaching is so busy that it's often driven by heuristics, and we work on autopilot. And so it's how do we make a habit of those things that we're working on, so they're not just one-offs or they don't become labored, they become the thing that the teacher chooses to do rather than the thing they were doing previously. And I think that's a role of coaching. So I think where some professional development maybe falls short at times is sometimes even if we notice the thing that needs to change or the thing that will be useful, it's another thing then to actually support the teacher practically and socially over time to make a habit of the solution. And that for me is the role of coaching. It's the things that happen between diagnosis and the end goal that enable the teacher to actually work on habitualizing the solution. And I think it's probably sensible to say that time scale is hugely variable, depending on who the teacher is, where their current practice is, what the change looks like, what the barriers they're facing might be, the complexity of the solution. Like we talk a lot about kind of breaking down techniques. So see, for those who know walkthroughs, it's a toolkit that takes teaching techniques and breaks them down into 5-step guides. But the real logic of that is that it's hard to work on complex techniques. It's hard to habitualize them when you take them as a whole, when you take the whole thing, say this is a sum of many parts, and suddenly we just want to be able to do it. And it doesn't always work. It doesn't work like that, but some are more complex than others. And so, you have to have that rhythm of support in place that enables teachers to habitualize the solutions that they're working on in a way that they own them and that they can, as you mentioned, become the default that they turn to when they recognize that situation arising again in their classrooms. You
mentioned the quality of feedback you received. I think we must have been in the game roughly the same amount of time. So obviously when we were forged in the fire of Ofsted once, feedback wasn't, about actual elements of your practice, wasn't necessarily on the agenda. Do you reckon your experience in the sort of the early to mid 00s has influenced how you want to support teachers now? Because I know for me, that's definitely a big driver.
Yeah, I think it's 100% the case. So for me, like there's quite rightly so. And I think, I've enjoyed being involved in coaching at a time currently where there's so much to learn from so many great people. and sometimes that causes disagreement and discussion at a level of like, this is coaching, this isn't coaching, it shouldn't be like that, it shouldn't look like that. I'm a bit more like you, I guess, where I kind of come over like, as long as it's not that, as long as it's not what it was, like there's a common sense element here. So yeah, I am a bit of a purist when it comes to coaching because I feel like I've researched it, done a lot of thinking about it, and so I have my views on what I think works and what it should look like. But I'm still very much like, there's a common sense element to taking a coaching stance if we define coaching as being the support for teachers practically and socially to enable changes in their practice. And then when we compare that to, as like you're describing there, what used to happen, where it was just like, here it is, do it, this is what I think. That just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so when I got into senior leadership, I mean, I certainly as a head of English and as a middle leader, but then when I had the opportunity to kind of shape professional development in school, that was my starting point, if I was honest. It wasn't like, God, I need to get stuck into instructional coaching and this is the way forward. That doesn't work. We need to think about something different. And there's a common sense approach here that says we have to help teachers to do the things we want them to do, or we have to help them solve the problems that they're facing in the classroom. We can't just tell them to change them. And that's still, it's a difficult shift for lots of schools. I still see lots and lots of schools who are at different stages when it comes to kind of shaping the culture around that, where it's a big thing to let go of. If you've always graded lessons, if you've always kind of run formal reviews, if you've always given feedback, it becomes the expectation that that's what a senior leader does. And on both sides, so sometimes you sit down with a teacher and you want to take a coaching stance to the dialogue, but the teacher has only ever known being told what the observer thinks, and they kind of look at you and they expect and invite you to just tell me what you think. It's like, and it takes a lot to kind of create a system that enables coaches and observers the confidence to say, there's no, I'm not going to tell you what I thought, but let's talk about what we've seen. And I think that's a big shift for me. That's I think I've digressed a bit there, but it's absolutely a reaction to my own experiences. I do think it's important to point out, if I can, that I worked with some brilliant senior leaders when I was starting out as well, and there wasn't malintent behind delivering ropey CPD or ropey feedback. It was well intended, but just a little bit naive in terms of what the impact would be. And of course, there's those external pressures from the inspectorate, and in Wales as well, the kind of consortium model which hovers above schools. It's like there's an expectation that you can prove it. Prove that these learning walks took place, or these observations took place. Prove how you know which teacher is where and what they do, and there's a big shift there that I see happening in the work that I do, where that kind of culture is kind of fizzling out a bit, I think, now, and being replaced by something that is a little bit more productive around helping teachers, supporting teachers to do a really difficult job.
Senior leaders back then were probably having to be, where you got the umbrella analogy, where they're protecting their teachers from a lot of the stuff. I think there was a lot of stuff to protect schools from, and one of the things you couldn't get right was the fact that you were going to be graded. Your lessons were going to be graded whenever the inspector came in, so they're going to have a 10-15 minute snapshot, and so you can totally see the reasons why. But I'm really glad we have sort of grown up through a time of challenge, respectful challenge towards authority, and actually the authority in the main have seemed to listen to quite a lot of things that have had to be said.
And people know what they know. That's the big thing for me, is people don't, I've never met a senior leader, and this is only my experience, so I'm sure they exist, but I've never met a senior leader who doesn't want to help teachers, who doesn't want their teachers to succeed, who doesn't want the students to succeed. In the same way, I've never met a teacher that doesn't want their students to do well. It's like, everybody wants to do it, but it's about harnessing that kind of mutual ambition to do well for the students, for the teachers. It's harnessing that and be brave enough to actually put systems in place that helps that happen. rather than hoping it happens, talking about it. And, I probably, you had a similar experience. Like, I remember sitting in an inset day in September and having the teaching and learning lead kind of introduce, this is what we're going to be doing, this is what we want everyone doing. And it was hard to see the relevance from my practice at the time, and B, it was like, and then we're going to come round in a month's time and just check that you're doing it. That was it. It's like thumbs up, thumbs down. Is everyone going to do this thing? And then we're going to come round and we're going to see that you're doing it. And oh no, nobody's doing it. Why is nobody doing it? It's because nobody knows how. Nobody knows how to do it. Nobody's really kind of forged that mental model around what the actions look like. What does that thing look like in my classroom, with my children, and my curriculum? It's very different at the front of the training room. We wonder why those things they never get done, do they? It just drags on. Then it's like, so there's an efficiency to I think the emerging approaches as well around, small changes deliberately enacted regularly and frequently, but seen through so that they actually land in the classroom. I think that's the key thing.
I can only imagine that must have been amplified in secondary, given that at least if someone's telling me something in September in primary school, there's a fair chance it's going to apply to at least one of the subjects I'm going to teach. But if your specific subject, I know Craig Barton always talks about how here's the general idea, but I can't tell you how it works in history, geography, etc.
Yeah, and listen, that's a massive challenge for coaching as well. Like, so I think for any PD, and we're kind of in the firing line with this a little bit, because a walkthrough is subject generic. It's they're general principles of teaching techniques, and that works well in the sense that the teacher is the expert. So in secondary, when I'm coaching secondary teachers, I'm not always coaching English teachers. My expertise is in English teaching, but I can coach a science teacher, I can coach a Welsh teacher or a French teacher, because they're the experts in the subject knowledge, and my job is to help them see where this thing fits and how it would help them. But they have to own it, they have to modify it and personalize it, and that's why the follow-up discussions are so important. Like, if you present a technique, if you present process questions to a body of staff who represent 11 different subject domains, that's going to look different in every classroom, in every subject area, but also with different classes as well. Like, if I'm teaching that to a year 7, or if I'm teaching a year 11, it's going to look different. And so teachers need time and support to think deeply about the technique, about where it fits, to make modifications that are appropriate to the context. And that hasn't happened historically because the systems haven't been there. I think that's fair to say. And that's what really excites me about schools who invest in building a realistic and sustainable coaching program, is that it enables teachers to actually take their time to work on those solutions, to personalize them, to modify them, to adapt them so that they make sense. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier on. Part of that is the practical social support side, that means that there's a greater chance the teacher's going to enact that technique or have a go at that technique when you're not there. And so I think that's a really important part of it. And it is a bit of an elephant in the room. I remember hearing Josh Goodrich talk about this a few years ago, actually, on a virtual research ed, I think it was. He was talking about kind of the evidence for and against subject-specific coaching and pedagogy generic coaching. And I think it's fair to say, right, in an ideal world, you'd probably want subject specialists coaching subject specialists. I think that seems natural. It seems sensible, because you can have a much more in-depth dialogue around curriculum. But going back to kind of guiding principles of coaching, building great coaching in schools, is it's got to be realistic and sustainable. And that's just not realistic in British schools. It's not realistic to have an arts coach and a woodwork coach and a French coach, and many schools only have one teacher. They have like departments of one, so you just can't do that, and so you've got to make the best of what is possible. And so I think acknowledging that's a barrier, acknowledging that solutions need to be contextualized to the domain in which they're going to be used, supporting the teachers to do that, I think enables you to use kind of generic pedagogical approaches as part of a productive coaching cycle.
Like you say, the expertise. Once you then develop an awareness of the strategy that might be combined with that, it almost opens up this next layer of thinking where you think, well, how do you use this?
And it's it's how do you unveil that next layer of teaching? And that's where those kind of traditional ad hoc cycles of professional development kind of fall down. Is you've got a teacher fired up about the technique and they want to use it, but they never have the chance to discuss how it might be used in their context, and so it never gets used. It never happens, or if it does, it gets kind of maladapted into something that doesn't necessarily serve the purpose. And so you've got to make that happen, and that's exactly it's a challenge, but that's absolutely key to it, I think.
So the next one, Neil, it's probably more in your wheelhouse, but I remember, Chris, you asked me a question on an unreleased textbooks episode way back in 2021-ish. And you asked me about whether or not textbooks would go online eventually. And I'm pretty sure I said, no, I couldn't imagine a world where this was possible. And then obviously things have accelerated in terms of the use of technology. But what do you think will be the biggest shift in the use of artificial intelligence in schools in the next academic year? So that's 24-25.
Only in the next academic year. I don't think there's going to be any massive monumental shifts. I think more teachers will become aware of it. More senior leaders will consider possibly a bit of basic training in it, and undoubtedly teachers will find it useful for some things and not very useful for other things. I remember again early on in my career trying to find the perfect image for setting descriptions. Well, that's now a thing of the past, and that's quite nice. You can take children's setting descriptions or character descriptions, put them into a large language model, and it will spit out the picture, and you could almost use that as a bit of fun bit of self-assessment. Does this look like what you thought you described? And if not, what do you need to change? But there's not going to be, I don't think, any sort of massive monumental shifts. I just think people are going to be using it more. Schools will either embrace it or they will try to put a stop to it because of all the data harvesting that are taking in getting LLM outputs involved, unless you have a specific educational or enterprise account, which obviously some schools will have, some schools won't have. So it's still in its infancy, and it's important to remember, even though this is an area I'm particularly interested in, not many schools and teachers are sort of using this on a regular basis if the teacher tap data is anything to go by. So the next year I think it will just kind of keep on flowing. More people will get used to it, more people will see it, hopefully more people will subscribe to teacher prompts, and we'll get that readership up a little bit.
I have to say, I assumed when I learned a bit about AI, and I know nothing about it basically. The only stuff that I do know comes from Neil's emails. So actually, I know a little more than nothing thanks to him. But I did kind of expect there to be more issues around June, July, as people were using them to write reports. Because that's the first thing that comes into mind for me. If you think about how often when you were writing reports, you're like, you know what? These two kids, they are remarkably similar. I am going to use quite similar. Obviously, I would never. Yeah, no, I did do that. But these two kids, they're basically similar. I'm going to take what I wrote for that kid and just adapt it a little bit to personalize it, because some schools you're writing 1,000, 2,000 words per pupil, and it's absurd. And I just kind of assume there's got to be some teachers out there that have been using AI for their reports, and I just kind of assumed there'd be more mistakes and accidents that would go viral as a result. Either teachers haven't caught on to the idea that this might be useful for reports, or AI is just so good that the parents aren't spotting the inevitable errors that slip through the net.
I don't think any of my kids had an AI generated reports. I mean, you can sometimes tell by some of the language that gets used, and sometimes it makes stuff up as well, doesn't it? You know, sometimes for a lot of our copy, you know, if it's not important and it just needs to be in there, we'll utilize, you know, what would you say in this situation kind of thing. And then it'll just make stuff up, you know, and I might as well have just spent the time writing it myself. What about the use of HTML, Neil? I saw Stephen Enigmailed on TikTok talking about how he made a Google app, or like a, what are they called? Plugin? Google plugin? Now, in my mind, you could ask a reasonably decent LME, is it double LME? No, it's just LLM. Oh, for God's sake.
Just LLM.
LLME is a local leader of mathematics education. That's why.
One of the same, really.
Yeah. You can ask a fairly decent LLM. I mean, like, not Copilot. You can't even ask it what day it is. But you can ask a decent one to write you the code, and then you can almost give them like multiple choice questions that mark themselves and stuff, and give you the data. Do you think that's something teachers will branch into, or is it because it's just a little bit beyond the technological reach of most of us that actually that's not going to happen?
I think that's pretty specialized, and again, you know, I have or know people who are coders, and some say, yeah, do you know what, it's really interesting how it codes, but you still need to go and sort of, you know, change things around. And I got no idea how to do any of that stuff. So even if you did try to get your large language model to code you a little application, I think there'd still be a fair little bit of work that you would have to do and have that knowledge to fix up or change or whatever it might be. So yeah, perhaps the computer science teachers at secondary might develop something if that's where, you know, where they've come from, or teachers who have a bit of a interest in coding. But certainly I don't think anything as specialized as that. So playing around with a little bit of Claude where you can just say, oh, I want to be able to move this interface, and I want to be able to reorder certain things and make sort of very brief, quick little games like that. But again, that's still in its infancy, and I don't think that's that's more in the 3 to 5 year line. I think not the immediate term.
So there we go. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed the sort of refresher on some of the conversations we've been having over the last 100 episodes. I certainly, when I went back to edit it, I thought, oh, I'll do 60 minutes, but actually it was closer to 2 hours, and it probably could have been closer to 5, maybe even 6 hours if I put everything I really wanted to put in there. But at some point I had to just stop. Yeah, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining us over the last 200 episodes, or 199 episodes, 200 very, very soon. And hopefully you'll join us for the next 200 as well, and way beyond. I think what are we in for, 20 years? So we'll probably get about 1,000 episodes at least. But until next time, thanks for listening.